Chapter 7 Reunion Synthesis. As I was checking into my hotel at the annual wildlife meeting 3 months later, I saw Joe in the lobby. "How are you, Joe?" I said, shaking his hand. "You look a lot different than the last time I saw you." "Hi, Tom. It's amazing what 100 showers and a haircut can do for a person," he laughed. "So, is everybody going to make it?" "Looks that way," he replied. "Even Becky, but she isn't getting in until tomorrow morning. Everyone else is here already. We're going to meet in the lobby at 6 tomorrow evening, grab some dinner, and then hide somewhere to go over what we have." "I'm really impressed with the progress we've made over the past few months," I said. We all had been in regular communication and had followed up on our pact to delve more into AIM by helping Joe with his project. "I am too," he replied. "I was afraid it would get put on the back burner and there wouldn't be any follow-through. I'm sure glad that you and Earl stuck with us. The wildlife management experience that you two have added really brings a substance to this effort." "Well, I'm glad we had the opportunity. I'm learning a lot that I think is going to make my work more rewarding." We exchanged a little small talk, comparing our travel experiences, getting to the conference. Then we shook hands again, confirming our commitment to meet the next evening for dinner with the group. "It's good seeing you, Joe. I look forward to getting together with the group tomorrow night." Shortly after we headed in different directions, I settled into the conference routine of meetings, papers, and impromptu exchanges with colleagues from all corners of the continent. The next night, the six of us convened in the hotel lobby at the appointed time. It was quite a reunion and brought home what a tremendous bonding experience the 2-week wilderness assignment had been. Furthermore, the shared quest to find a better way of doing business had kept us connected and cemented our friendship and professional relationship. After dinner, we settled into a quiet cafe and resumed the task we had been collaborating on remotely for a few months. "Let me kick this off by telling everyone how much I appreciate the information and exchange so far," Joe said. "I've learned a lot, and it's actually been fun. This little project has gotten me pretty enthused," Earl added. "It's caused me to look in a different light at how decisions are made in my program. It's stuff I use almost every day. Susan, why don't you outline the adaptive impact management process, and then we can each elaborate on the components we worked on," Joe suggested. "Well, AIM focuses on impacts as the fundamental objectives of management and uses a structured process to achieve decision making," she began. "Susan," I interjected, "could you quickly go over again what impacts are in this context?" Referring to a piece of paper with some notes on it, Susan said, "Sure. The literature defines impacts as the important socially defined effects of events and interactions related to wildlife that merit management." She continued, "AIM has 8 primary components: situational analysis, objective setting, development of system models, identification and selection of management alternatives, actual management interventions, monitoring, refinement of models, and eventually adaptation of interventions." "One thing that intrigues me about AIM," said Pat, "is that it builds on the strengths of systems thinking, uh, where you develop and understand. One thing that intrigues me about AIM," said Pat, "is that it builds on the strengths of systems thinking, where you develop an understanding of how key factors involved in bear management, for example, relate to each other, and adaptive resource management, or ARM, where you approach management as an experiment. Yet, AIM differs from adaptive resource management in that its fundamental management objectives are impacts on society rather than conditions of a wildlife population or habitat. AIM incorporates the essential human dimensions of wildlife management." "Yes," Earl added, but the enabling objectives to address the desired impacts still may focus on populations or habitat, depending on the alternatives. That's where ARM is important. True, I said, but enabling objectives identified by AIM also could lead you to other approaches that we haven't traditionally used. Education, for example, focused strategically on informing people or altering their behavior. AIM emphasizes stakeholder involvement in management and shared learning among scientists, managers, and stakeholders, Susan continued. And that is one of the primary ways it differs from some of the other adaptive approaches I've examined. Joe, can you give us an overview of what you looked into? Situational analysis? Situational analysis, he said, essentially is the foundational process for decision making. It involves gathering existing and new information in order to understand the breadth and depth of the management context. Isn't that where some of the graphical descriptions of trends and relationships are used? I asked. Right, as a first attempt at depicting the management system, but more of that comes later with actual model development, Joe replied. What would happen if you didn't conduct this step? Earl asked. One risk, Joe said, is that managers and stakeholders might not agree on what the real issues are and might not work with the same information. It helps define the scope of the situation so those engaged with have a common understanding of what they are dealing with. Do stakeholders help in this analysis? I asked. Actually, he replied, stakeholder involvement strategies are developed at this stage because this is the initial step in defining the universe you'll be working in, which naturally leads to defining stakeholders. With my bear example, if you recall, this is where the realization came that the issue went well beyond the borders of the lands I manage. The potential impacts could include bear concerns in nearby residential areas, hunting and bear population issues in the state management zone our lands are within, and so on. Situational analysis helps us identify who needs to be at the table. Thanks, Joe, Susan said. Okay, Becky, would you address objective setting? Glancing at her notes, Becky began, AIM emphasizes formulation of objectives through citizen participation because participating stakeholders are more likely to accept ownership of the objectives and provide enduring support. As we noted, we can think of two types of objectives, fundamental and enabling. Fundamental objectives represent the desired future condition or outcome. Enabling objectives are milestones and means to achieve fundamental objectives. So how do these relate to impacts? Earl asked. Fundamental objectives are derived directly from identification of impacts. Recall that impacts are the most important of the effects from interactions with wildlife that stakeholders identify, she answered. But how do fundamental and enabling objectives link to each other? I asked. Each fundamental objective, she replied, should have at least one enabling objective associated with it. Often there are several, as indicated in the examples you and Earl provided over the last couple of months. Oh, and each enabling objective should be tied to at least one fundamental objective. For example, the fundamental objective might be less damage by deer to vehicles, crops, or ornamental plants. There could be several enabling objectives that address various aspects of the impact, such as education to inform people how to minimize damage, population management to reduce deer, and habitat management to minimize conflicts in particular areas. I presume that agreement on the fundamental objectives comes first? I asked. Ideally, Becky agreed. A fundamental objective in the bear situation, Joe added, is to relieve the anxiety level of people living in the area, whether their discomfort about bears is based on fear of bears or on anger and frustration over damage caused by bears. At the same time, some people want to avoid a management scenario that would lead to too few bears. An enabling objective may need to be struck in this situation to increase the level of education about how to coexist with bears and avoid conflicts. Other enabling objectives may be needed as well. I've fallen into this trap in the past, Earl said. In retrospect, I can see many situations where we came up with an enabling objective and selected the actions to achieve it, only to create a fundamental objective to justify our plan. We used to call it a solution in search of a problem. We've lowered the big game hunting age for the sake of recruiting hunters, and then used objectives, such as needing greater deer harvest, to reduce conflicts to justify the need for more hunters. I think our agencies are all guilty of similar acts, said Susan. It's a tough trap to avoid, but enabling objectives represent pathways of sorts, and we're inclined to choose those paths that are most familiar and comfortable. How are these objectives established? Earl asked. One example would be to have your management team conduct the situational analysis and identify key stakeholders, Becky continued. You could hold meetings where you initially frame the situation with a small group of stakeholders, then engage the broader community to get their input and make modifications based on that input. You then work with a representative set of stakeholders to identify the effects. Explain effects again, I asked. Effects, in this case, are the results of interactions between bears and people, bears and habitat, bears and bears, people and people over bears, or people and bear habitat, she answered. That could be huge, Earl observed. Potentially, Becky agreed. But stakeholders tend to focus on the most important effects, and those will be the ones that represent the first attempt at identifying impacts, or the most important of the effects. The management team takes the impacts, categorizes them, and then, through small group meetings or mail surveys, identifies the most important impacts, the ones that will become the focus of management and be translated into fundamental objectives. Again, the stakeholders need to be informed and have opportunity to stay engaged throughout the project. Good work, Becky, Susan said. Pat, would you discuss model development? Pat sat up straighter and cleared his throat. Wildlife management, of course, is not a neat and clean laboratory experiment, he began. Management decisions are always a challenge because the environment we operate in is complex and loaded with uncertainties. We have to live with the complexity and uncertainty when we make decisions, and in many cases, a lot of the information we have about the system is qualitative. Model development can help us deal with these challenges. It's a tool that can clarify key decision points and help us anticipate what the outcomes of a decision might be. In that respect, it helps us learn more about systems. Adaptive approaches all are designed to increase our rate of learning through the systems we manage, so we can better understand them and, over time, design approaches that will better meet our fundamental objectives. And how does modeling help us meet our fundamental objectives? Earl asked. It gives us a more explicit vision and picture of a system. Then we can better understand how system components relate to one another, Pat explained. That, in turn, helps us understand and communicate how different management actions influence the system as a whole. Just the exercise of building a model can lead to a greater understanding of the system you manage, Susan added, as well as help you realize how little we typically understand it, I offered. Exactly, Pat replied. Modeling is an iterative process where steps are often retraced, and sooner or later, it gives us feedback on the parts of the system least understood. As we learn more, we may change the way we define management problems. The things we learn can lead to innovative proposals about how to solve a particular management problem, and in cases where we might develop a working model, modeling is a tool to think through management proposals before triggering the expense of pilot testing them on the ground. Okay, Pat, that helps clarify why a manager might consider modeling as a decision-making tool, I said. What key points do we want to communicate about the how-to aspects of modeling? How does a manager actually build a model? One that will reasonably simulate management? Well, in Joe's case, he won't have time to go into the whole field of system dynamics for his presentation to his senior staff, but he should be able to assure his administrators that modeling involves a well-defined set of steps. Modelers usually start with a careful effort to define the problem they want to understand. They go on to develop hypotheses about the cases or the causes of the problem. Then they attempt to build a model of that system, test the model, and eventually use it to evaluate proposed management actions. Joe will want to his agency leaders to recognize this as an iterative process so that the steps don't always occur in the same order. Also, learning along the way may prompt a modeling team to repeat a previous step. Model building is a creative process with well-defined guidelines, but there isn't a rigid recipe to follow. Should I point out what you meant by a modeling team? Asked Joe. I'll bet that some administrators in my agency would rather just ask an outside consultant to build a model for them. Pat nodded. You're right. The process we are suggesting is best handled by a small team of managers who develop their model as a group exercise. Obviously, this calls for a set of technical modeling skills. Some agencies will have that capacity in-house, and others will need to secure those skills through an outside consultant. But this isn't the kind of work you want dropped on your desk in the form of a final report from a consultant. To be useful, you really want this process to involve a team of managers who can bring different experiences and expertise to the project. The purpose of model building is to learn more about a system, and the most and best learning is likely to occur among members of the team actively engaged in model building. We want to point out that model building should be a hands-on process for management teams, and they should think of it as a tool for learning rather than prediction? Asked Susan. Couldn't have said it any better, replied Pat with a grin. It still might sound a bit overwhelming to my director, said Joe. Aren't there some software packages available to make this modeling work a little less daunting to folks? Sure, replied Pat. Managers can use a couple of different software packages to build simulations, and they seem to be making model building accessible to a broader audience every year. The important point for wildlife managers is that you don't have to be a modeler to get started. You and your team can start by sketching what you know in a concept map or manager's model. That exercise alone is worthwhile. Even if you can't do simulations, you can get an appreciation of the complexity you're working with, the major components of the management system, and the assumptions you are making about important cause-effect relationships. Okay, Susan said, looking at me. You're up. What can you tell us about identification and selection of alternatives? This is where we identify potential management interventions, I began. Do stakeholders have a role here? Becky asked. Absolutely, I said. As Earl mentioned earlier, we tend to stick to the same old solutions we're comfortable with, whereas stakeholders may bring some creative ideas from outside our usual frame of reference. The proposed interventions represent ways to achieve enabling objectives, and they must be continually analyzed in relation to the fundamental objectives. All right, Earl, Mr. Manager, key us in on management interventions, Susan said next. Well, in my experience, it's unrealistic to expect a single model to be best for your management situation on the first try. This adaptive approach allows for that uncertainty and encourages use of more than one model. You can have alternative competing models for the system. As I understand it from email and phone calls with Pat, some of the software he mentioned would allow development of competing models and experimentation with management interventions. Depending on how the pieces of your model perform based on field observations, you can get a sense of what model or models best depict the situation you have, and then test the effects of proposed management strategies. I wish I had a better understanding of these things, because I'd sure like to experiment with them to design better management plans. You need to get Pat to do a detail with you, Joe suggested. I was thinking that too. What do you say, Pat? Can you teach an old dog some new tricks? Earl asked with a smile. Pat grinned back. If you'll teach me some of the old ones. He reached across the table and exchanged a high five with Earl. Ladies and gentlemen, intoned Joe as if in front of a large audience. The clap of thunder you just heard was merely the sound of the generation gap slamming shut. Everyone laughed. Rather than look embarrassed by Joe's remark, both Pat and Earl looked pleased with the truth as well as the humor of it. Tell us what you learned about the monitoring aspects first, Pat, Susan said, continuing the professional topic, but unable to suppress a lingering grin. A really important step that's often lacking in adaptive management is rigorous evaluations of results of management actions, Pat said. You need evidence that your management is or is not generating the response desired, so you need to have monitoring mechanisms that give you an earlier warning than a call from the governor's office. It also relates to what Earl was saying in that in feedback you get also helps identify the model that best represents the system. And that, Susan said, leads into the last component, adjustment. As you gain knowledge about the system, or as the system changes over time, you refine the models. If model prediction fails, it could be because the model needs adjustment. Or it could be that the management was not implemented properly. We need to monitor and adjust management interventions. So, Joe said, spraying his arms, I've been able to rethink the bear situation with the info each of you provided to me. I've developed a framework that I'll use as a foundation for my presentation. That's great, said Susan, and the rest of us nodded in agreement. Joe continued, but I don't think we can let it end here. You've all been so generous with your time and have really invested in this. What do you have in mind, Joe? Becky asked. I think we should seriously consider a conference paper so we can share this with others. I'm also thinking of something that would be even more of a contribution and ultimately more fulfilling. I'm all ears, Susan said. Obviously, each of us needs to go back to our agencies and look for opportunities to apply this approach, Joe said. Amen, Earl replied. What I'm thinking, he said, is that we keep each other in the loop to share our experiences as they unfold, to form a continuing collaboration. I think Joe's on the right track, I offered. We've made some intellectual progress here, all because we had the luxury of time before the fog lifted, literally and figuratively. Now, we have to try out these ideas. But how can we do that given the restrictions we each have in our jobs? Pat asked. If we can get support from our agencies to apply this approach, even on a pilot project, Earl added, we'll form our own teams. We can still interact and share what we're learning with each other. I know I'd like to try this out, but I'm going to need help with this modeling. I suspect we've got some folks with the skills Pat has, but having Pat look at our modeling, having me review Pat's management techniques, and having Becky take a look at all our objectives would be very useful. I think we'd learn a lot. And the product would be greater than the sum of our individual efforts, Susan said enthusiastically. Well, I don't see anybody disagreeing, Earl said, looking around the table. Now we just have to get after it. Great, said Joe. I say we toast to a job well started. Bartender, a pitcher of filtered water, a spoon, and a jar of your finest tang for my colleagues.